A flash tore across the sky, seconds before the impact. The metallic screech of the car flipping over sounded like a series of broken thunderclaps. Helen slammed on the brakes so hard the seatbelt punched her chest like a fist. She barely had time to breathe before throwing open her door and running down the wet highway, the ground sinking beneath her soaked sneakers. A vehicle had flipped on the opposite side of the road, tipped onto its side, with thick smoke pouring from the crumpled hood. Heavy rain pounded the twisted metal, as if trying to smother the fire beginning to take hold. She slipped as she got closer, but caught herself with one hand on the asphalt. There was no time. The smoke already reeked of gasoline. Heat pulsed beneath the wreck, and tiny flames flickering in the seams of the frame signaled imminent danger. Helen shouted but got no reply. She tried the driver's door. It was locked. She rushed to the other side, dropped to her knees, and peered through the shards of glass. A man, unconscious, his head slumped to one side, face covered in blood, his chest rising and falling with effort. She grabbed a nearby rock and struck the side window with all the strength she had left after a 16-hour shift. The glass cracked but held. Another hit, then another. Finally, a sharp crack, and the window shattered. Helen reached in, unlocked the door, and with muscles trembling from tension and exhaustion, slid her arms under the man's lifeless body. The stench of smoke and burning fluids was unbearable. The heat was real, brutal, like the whole car might blow at any second. She strained to pull the man out, dragging him inch by inch, his weight wrenching her back, the rain making every movement harder. A loud crack behind her. The fire had reached the engine. With a muffled cry, Helen shoved the body away from the wreck and threw herself with him over the edge of the shoulder, shielding his head with her own arm. 2 seconds later, the explosion lit everything in red. She landed on her side, gasping. The man wasn't moving. Helen rolled him onto his back, tilted his head, checked for signs of life. Faint. She began CPR, hands steady on his rain-soaked chest, counting each compression silently, not allowing herself to think about anything else. 1, 2, 3, mouth to mouth. The wind whipped the rain into her face. She repeated the motions on instinct, like her own life depended on it. Then the man coughed. A weak spray of blood spilled from the corner of his mouth. His eyes opened for a second, dark, lost, then faded again. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Helen looked up at the road. An ambulance was approaching. She stood, unsteady, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and stepped aside, letting the paramedics take over. She didn't wait for thanks, didn't say who she was. She simply walked back to her car, shaking, knees buckling, and drove home. Hours later, hands braced against the sink, she watched the water run as she scrubbed the skin on her arms like she could wash the smoke smell off. No tears, no words. The image of the bloodied face still pulsed in her mind. But Helen wasn't the type to dramatize what she did. She was a nurse. Saving people was part of who she was. And that man, whoever he was breathing because of her. On the road, the paramedics were finishing up stabilizing the patient when one of them tripped over something by the shoulder. A scorched briefcase, half open, inside wet papers, some unreadable. In the middle of them, a photograph, 2 figures with the faces ripped out, clearly torn by hand. The man in the photo, however, was unmistakable. The older police officer stepped forward and recognized him instantly. "This is impossible," he whispered, carefully picking up the photo. "That's Nathaniel Crowe. I thought he was dead." The ambulance lights reflected in the officer's eyes. He looked back at the man inside the vehicle, now breathing with the help of machines. "What the hell happened to you?" he muttered. But Nathaniel didn't answer. He was unconscious, and no one, not even him, knew what would come next. "Helen, this is the 2nd time this week," said the utility company representative on the phone, while Helen leaned her forehead against the kitchen wall. "The deadline is today. After that, it enters the system, and there's no way to avoid the shut-off." She thanked her in a faint voice, hung up, and looked at the folded piece of paper she had left on top of the fridge. The electric bill had been overdue for 3 days. Next to it, another bill for gas, and a third, stamped in red, hospital, immediate payment required. It was for her mother's treatment. In the background, she heard coughing. Her mother was waking up. Helen took a deep breath, grabbed the coffee pot, now cold, and poured the remaining coffee into the same old mug. The one with the broken handle, glued back together with super glue nearly a year ago. She set the mug on the table, buttered 2 slices of bread, and carried everything to the bedroom. "Good morning, Mom. Is it morning already?" The weak voice replied, eyes half open and unfocused. "It is, and there's coffee and warm bread. Want help sitting up?" She helped her mother lift her torso and propped the pillows behind her back. The woman gave a tired smile, the kind that says thank you without needing words. Helen sat beside her in silence, waiting for the coffee to cool a little more. At the hospital, the shift was busy. An elderly woman had been brought in, confused after a fall. Helen was administering medication, while one of the techs on the other side of the curtain struck up a conversation. "Did you see the news? The man from the accident. That explosion in the mountains. It was that Nathaniel Crowe guy, the CEO who disappeared. Everyone's talking about it." Helen didn't respond. "They say he vanished after his wife and son died. Remember that plane crash in Mexico? That was his family. Sounds like he lost it, was driving alone in the middle of nowhere. Can you believe that?" Helen folded the edge of the patient's sheet and left the room without a word. She walked to the bathroom and washed her hands for too long. The sound of the running water felt different that day. She looked at herself in the mirror, deep circles under her eyes, marks on her face from the mask. Her reflection revealed no emotion, but inside, something was turning. It wasn't curiosity. It was emptiness, as if the information didn't belong to her, as if she weren't the same person. She returned to the nurse's station. The TV on the wall showed a grim-faced news anchor. The headline read, "Nathaniel Crowe reappears after months. Multi-millionaire involved in serious accident. Disappeared from clinic 2 days later." Helen didn't ask, didn't comment. She just turned off the TV and went back to work like nothing had been said. At the end of her shift, sitting in the hospital's outdoor area, she watched cars pass on the distant highway. She held a cup of tea, but didn't drink. A new nurse approached, pulling her jacket tight against the cold. "Helen? That guy from the accident? It was you who pulled him out of the car, wasn't it?" She didn't answer right away, took a small sip of tea, and looked at the girl like she was weighing whether it was worth saying anything. "I was just passing by. The car was on fire. I did what anyone would do." The other girl gave a short laugh. "Anyone else would have filmed it. You saved a man worth millions. You're probably famous and don't even know it." "I'm not famous," Helen replied, already standing, "just late for the bus." The way home was always the same, a crowded bus to the final stop, then 15 minutes walking down a gravel road. Helen walked in the dark, hands buried in the pockets of her worn-out coat, dodging puddles without really noticing them. The sound of crickets in the distance, the smell of wet earth, the zipper of her coat scratching her chin, it was all part of the routine. She got home. The hallway light still worked. She walked in slowly and checked her mother's room. She was asleep. Helen went to the kitchen, lit the stove, but only heard the dry click of the igniter. Weak gas. She sighed. She grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl, sat in the chair on the porch. The sky was clear, unlike the night of the explosion. The same sky that hung over the hospital, the road, and, she now knew, someone like Nathaniel Crowe. She looked up at the sky like someone waiting for an answer, but there was no answer. There never was. Just a disfigured man breathing because she pulled him out of hell. And even so, nothing in her life had changed, not a single thing. 2 days later, a letter arrived from City Hall, notice of a sanitary inspection on the property. She knew what that meant. Pressure to sell, to move, to leave. That afternoon, she washed the dishes more forcefully. The old plates, the pots with burnt bottoms, water splashed against her apron, and still she washed everything as if she had time, as if she had peace. When she finished, she sat on the couch with her mother and rubbed lotion into her hands, thin hands with paper-thin skin and protruding bones. Her mother fell asleep again. Helen stayed there, stroking her fingers like holding onto a secret. Later, the TV on low volume showed images from a press conference. The anchor said that Nathaniel Crowe had disappeared again after leaving the clinic without authorization, that he'd left personal documents behind, that no one knew where he was. Helen changed the channel. The remote creaked in her hand. Her eyes didn't change, neither hardened nor softened. In place of the news, an old cooking show came on. A smiling woman explained how to make corn soup with homemade bread. Helen left the TV on and went to the bedroom to cover her mother. In the end, no one she knew was named Nathaniel. The man she pulled out of the car that night just needed to breathe, and she had done that. Nothing more. There, in the silence of a house with no hot water, with bills piling up and windows that wouldn't close properly, life went on just the same. And maybe that was the point. Not every heroic act changes the world. Sometimes it just ensures someone stays in it. The grocery bag slipped from Helen's hand before she even reached the doorframe. The apple rolled until it hit the first step of the porch, but she didn't bend down to pick it up. She just stood there, staring at the man sitting on the front steps of her house. He was there, elbows resting on his knees, eyes lost in the direction of the brush lining the dirt road. His cap was pulled low, hiding part of his face, but not enough. The grown-out hair, the unshaven beard, the worn clothes, and still, Helen knew exactly who he was. "You saved me," he said without turning. His voice sounded more like a thought than something spoken out loud. She stood motionless, her eyes searched for an explanation. What was he doing here? How had he found her home? Why wasn't he surrounded by bodyguards, journalists, the police? "How?" she began, but stopped, took a deep breath, then slowly bent to pick up the apple. "What are you doing here?" He looked at her for the first time. His eyes seemed different. They weren't the same ones she'd seen half open on the side of the road. Now they looked hollow inside, occupied by something that couldn't be spoken aloud. "I don't know," he replied. "I just came." She held the apple like it was a weapon. She wanted to tell him to leave, but couldn't find the strength. Anger didn't come. Fear didn't either. What remained was the quiet confusion that settles in when something doesn't make sense, but also doesn't feel threatening. "Do you need something?" "Water. And maybe just a few minutes, if it's not too much trouble." She looked at him again. The edges of his clothes were damp, his shoes covered in dust. The backpack on his shoulders looked lighter than it should have. There was nothing of the millionaire from the news in that figure. Nothing of the powerful CEO who vanished after a tragedy. Helen opened the door without saying anything else. He stood with effort and followed her inside in silence. She gestured to the kitchen chair and went to the sink. As he sat, the sound of running water was the only thing filling the room. She handed him the glass. He drank slowly. His hands were trembling a little, maybe from the cold, maybe from something else shaking inside. "How did you find out where I live?" "I didn't really find it. I followed the clues, the hospital, the name on your badge, then an ambulance driver. It wasn't hard." She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "Why?" "Because I needed to see you, to know why you saved me." Helen looked at him more closely. For the first time she realized there was no edge to his voice, no arrogance, no challenge. It was a real question, and a plea. hiding behind it. Because you were alive, and I could pull you out. That's what we do. He nodded slightly, like someone hearing an answer they already knew, but still needed to hear aloud. You didn't want to know who I was? No. Why not? Because it doesn't matter. He lowered his head, as if exhausted. His shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the empty glass. Can I stay here tonight? Just tonight? I don't have anywhere else to go. Helen hesitated. Every part of her urged caution. This was strange, unusual, but there was something in his eyes that reminded her of the terminal patients she had cared for in the hospital. That emptiness that didn't ask for pity, just a final place to be without needing to explain. There's an old couch in the living room. I'll get a blanket. He looked up. For the first time, there was something like gratitude in his expression, but he didn't say thank you. Helen grabbed a blanket from the closet and spread it over the couch. When she returned to the kitchen, he was still sitting there, fingers turning the empty glass. He didn't ask for anything, didn't say another word. She washed the dinner dishes, prepared her mother's medication, and checked her temperature before going to bed. The sound of the shower was never heard. He didn't get up to explore the house. He just stayed where he was. In the middle of the night, Helen woke to a faint noise. She went to the hallway and saw him on the porch again, sitting, eyes lost in the dark. As she approached, he didn't turn. Do you need something? Just a little silence. This kind, it's different. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. The moon lit part of his face. It was like looking at someone trying to remember how to breathe. Good night, she said, and went back to bed. The next morning, her mother woke up early. Helen was making breakfast when she heard a soft voice from the living room. You came back to fix the fence. I knew you'd come. Nathaniel replied with a hesitant smile. Maybe. Helen watched from the kitchen. Her mother was smiling, confused, but calm. He was on his knees in front of her, helping her put on her slippers like he already knew the gesture. And for a moment, he didn't seem out of place. He didn't seem like a stranger. At the breakfast table, the three of them ate in silence. He didn't speak, but spread jelly carefully on her mother's bread. He cleared the dishes afterward and washed them without being asked. When Helen left for work, she looked back one last time. He was in the yard, sitting on the porch steps, staring at the packed dirt ground. She didn't know what this was, but for some reason, she didn't tell him to leave. The plate of rice slipped from Helen's hand and shattered on the kitchen floor. Nathaniel, who had been stacking chairs in the backyard, rushed in as soon as he heard the noise. She was already crouched down, gathering the shards with an old cloth. You okay? He asked cautiously. Just slipped, she replied without looking at him. No need to stop what you're doing. He knelt beside her, picking up a larger piece of the broken plate. Was it the one with the blue rim? It was. Silence. Just the sound of shards clinking into the metal bucket. When they finished, she washed her hands at the sink, dried them on her apron, and said, I've got 2 visits today, Mrs. Selma and Mr. Arthur. If you want to come, just get in the car. He didn't answer right away, but minutes later he showed up with his backpack slung over one shoulder, ready to leave. On the way, Helen drove with the window down, the wind tugging at the loose strands of her hair. Nathaniel watched everything. The spaced-out houses, the thick brush along the roadside, the leaning power poles, the rusted soccer goal on the edge of a dusty field. It all felt like another world. She parked in front of a weathered wooden house with a small garden of dried-out plants, clapped her hands at the gate, pushed it open and walked in, Nathaniel following behind. Mrs. Selma? Out here on the porch, dear, came a frail voice. An elderly woman with white hair and squinting eyes sat bundled in a blanket. Helen knelt down, checked her blood pressure, her glucose, asked about the meds. All of it with a calm that felt built over years. Nathaniel stood to the side, observing. The woman looked at him for a few seconds before smiling, as if seeing something forgotten. "This young man, he looks like my son. Are you my son?" Helen looked up at Nathaniel. He didn't say anything, just knelt slowly and held the old woman's hand. "I can be, if you'd like." She laughed softly, then closed her eyes. She kept holding his hand for a long time, even in silence. When they left, Helen noticed his eyes were damp. "You okay?" She remembered someone, even if it wasn't me. The second visit was to Arthur's house, a blind man who had lived alone since his wife passed. Helen changed the dressings on his feet, cleaned the stove, organized his medication. Meanwhile, Nathaniel washed the dishes without being asked, then swept the living room. Back in the car, Helen spoke for the first time since they'd left. "Didn't think this would be your kind of place." "It's not," he replied, "but maybe it should be." That night, Helen fell asleep on the couch, her head resting on her mother's lap. An old show played on the TV, the volume barely audible. Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table watching, his eyes fixed on her, as if he couldn't explain what he saw, but knew it mattered. He stood up quietly, grabbed the blanket from the armchair, and draped it over them. Then he turned off the living room light and stood there in the dark for a few minutes. The only sound was the breathing of mother and daughter in rhythm. Helen dreamed. In the dream, she was back on the road. The burning car, thick smoke, the sound of the explosion repeating. But this time she couldn't open the door. The glass wouldn't break. Her hands bled. The man inside pounded on the window, screaming. She screamed back, but no sound came out. She woke up gasping, sweat on her neck. The kitchen light was on. She got up and walked in. Nathaniel stood with his back to her, stirring something in a pot on the stove. The smell of tea filled the room. "Nightmare?" She nodded. "Fire." He didn't ask anything else, just poured a cup, set it on the table, sat down across from her without a word. Helen took a sip. It was warm, herbal. She looked at him. The unshaven face, the messy hair, those eyes still holding that quiet blankness. "You know how to cook?" "I used to," he said. "I forgot for a while." She didn't say anything. The steam from the tea rose between them. The next morning, a dog's bark woke the house. Nathaniel was the first outside. He found a skinny puppy in the yard, its paws muddy. He picked it up and carried it inside. He was shivering. Must have gotten lost. Helen looked from the sink, rinsing a glass. "Put him on the blanket in the living room. We'll see later if he has an owner." Later on, he fed it scraps of bread and sat with the puppy in his lap, petting it in silence. Helen's mother, seeing them, said, "Now it really feels like a home." At the end of the day, Helen was preparing dinner. She chopped vegetables while Nathaniel dried dishes. She slipped trying to reach a tall bowl, and he caught her arm firmly. For a second, they were too close. She slowly pulled her arm away. He looked down. "You okay?" "I'm fine." The bowl was forgotten on the counter. When Helen went to bed that night, she heard the sound of her mother's old radio playing softly in the living room. Barefoot, she walked over and saw Nathaniel sitting in the dark, the dog curled at his feet. He didn't notice her watching. His eyes were closed, head gently nodding to the rhythm of the music. She went back to her room without making a sound. She lay down, stayed there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, while the muffled sound of the radio filled the silence of the night. She didn't know what was happening. She only knew that, in some strange and unexpected way, that broken man was starting to fill spaces she thought had been empty for far too long. The hammer slipped from Nathaniel's hand and hit the porch floor with a dull thud. Helen, kneeling beside him, looked up immediately. "You okay?" she asked, still holding the wooden board. He rubbed his hand, flexing his fingers. Slipped. Didn't break anything. She reached for the hammer, and as she did, the back of his hand brushed against her arm. A second too long. The touch was brief, unintentional, but enough to freeze them both for a moment. Helen looked down, back to the board. He picked up the hammer in silence. They'd been working on repairs for 3 days. The porch of one of the older neighbors had partially collapsed, and Helen had offered to help. Nathaniel came along unprompted. They'd spent hours together, measuring, sawing, hammering, getting their hands dirty. Neither had much experience with woodwork, but he learned quickly. His body seemed to remember what his mind had forgotten. As they hammered in silence, the sun beat down hard overhead. Nathaniel wiped the sweat from his brow with the hem of his shirt. Helen noticed the subtle scars on his arms, thin, deep lines like old cuts. "Did you used to do this kind of work?" she asked, during a break between hammer strikes. "My dad was a mason. I helped out when I was a kid, before college, before—" He paused. "Before everything." She didn't respond, just nodded. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was dense, layered. Back at the house later that day, Helen was washing her hands at the kitchen sink when she saw Nathaniel sitting on the living room floor, a toolbox open beside him. He was fixing the loose hinge on the lower cabinet. Said nothing. Just got to work. The dog was asleep at the foot of the armchair, head resting on a pillow. Helen's mother sat in her rocking chair, watching it all with calm eyes. "That one," she said, smiling slightly, "has hands that have held heavy things." Helen smiled, but didn't comment. She opened the fridge and took out a few ingredients. "Want to help chop vegetables?" she asked. "Only if you don't mind uneven cuts," he replied, getting up to wash his hands. At the counter, they worked together. Helen sliced carrots, he peeled potatoes. At one point, she reached for the paring knife and accidentally touched the blade. A quick cut, not deep, but enough to draw blood. Nathaniel reacted instantly, grabbing her wrist firmly. "Let me see." She tried to pull her arm back, but he didn't let go. He grabbed a clean cloth and pressed it against the wound. They were close. Too close. Her eyes locked on his, their breath caught in the space between them. "It's fine," she whispered. He let go slowly, as if reluctant, as if the gesture had lasted longer than it should have. "Sorry." Reflex. She turned away, washed the cut, and grabbed a bandage. "It's nothing." That night, Helen searched for an old box of photos in the back of the closet. Her mother had asked to see pictures from the days with her father. When she opened the box, the memories spilled out uninvited. Yellowed photos, bent corners, smiles swallowed by time. She spread a few on the table. Nathaniel came closer and picked one up. "This you?" "Yeah, I must have been about 7 there." In the picture, a little girl in a blue dress held the hand of a tall man in a dusty cap and boots. "You smiled with your whole body," he said, almost in awe. "Almost no one does that." Helen looked down, pretending not to hear. She picked up another photo, this one of her and her mother sitting on the curb, selling homemade sweets. "My dad made the sweets. We sold them outside the school." Nathaniel didn't comment, just looked at it like he was seeing something that hurt. "I liked it," she continued. "Not for the sweets, but because we were together, even in the sun." He nodded slowly, but didn't smile. 2 days later, Helen took him to Ottavio's house, an elderly man who had lost much of his mobility. The front porch was rotting, sinking with each step. Nathaniel measured the boards, adjusted the nails, scribbled notes on a folded piece of paper. "It's gonna be a job," he said, pencil between his teeth. "Yeah, but Ottavio's in there, sitting in the dark, 'cause he's afraid of falling when he walks. We can at least get him into the sun." "We?" he teased. "Sure, you're the one who knows how to measure." They worked side by side for hours. He hammered, she held the boards. In the afternoon, Helen bought 2 sodas and cheese rolls from the corner bakery. They sat on the front steps, eating in silence. "I used to do this with my son," Nathaniel said out of nowhere. "Simple snacks. He loved cheese bread and grape juice, never wanted soda, said it stung his tongue." Helen didn't respond, just handed him her soda like a peace offering. "What was his name?" she asked softly. "Daniel." She looked straight ahead. The sun was sinking low, painting everything in rust tones. "Thanks for telling me." He nodded, wordless. The silence between them was heavier now, but more intimate too. That night, when they got home, Helen's mother was sitting at the table, slowly combing her hair. Nathaniel brought in the radio and tuned it to an oldies station. A song from the 70s began to play, slow with guitar and soft horns. Without a word, he reached his hand out to Helen. She hesitated for a second, then took it. They danced slowly in the center of the room, barely moving their feet, their hands intertwined but without pressure. The dog circled them, curious. Her mother watched in silence, as if she knew this wasn't something to interrupt. When the song ended, they released each other's hands without hurry. He picked up the radio. She walked to the kitchen. Neither of them spoke about what had just happened. But in that gesture, in those bodies remembering how to move in each other's time, something had shifted, and they both knew it. The kettle whistled on the stove before the sun had even risen. Nathaniel turned off the burner carefully and poured the hot water into 2 mugs already set on the table. In one, he let a chamomile tea bag steep. In the other, peppermint. He knew Helen always preferred the latter in the morning. Meanwhile, he cut 2 slices of the day-old bread, toasted them in a pan with a bit of butter, and arranged everything on a chipped white plate. He placed it in the center of the table. The small radio on the shelf murmured a distant newscast. Helen appeared in the kitchen doorway, her eyes still heavy, wearing a sweatshirt far too big for her frame. She stopped when she caught the smell. "Everything ready already?" "Almost," he said, adding sugar to her mother's tea. "Just waiting on you." She pulled out a chair, glanced at the set table, then at him. "This a new tradition now?" "Just routine, but if you want to call it tradition, I won't argue." Helen's mother appeared soon after, leaning on her cane. Nathaniel helped her sit, cut the toast into smaller pieces on her plate, and adjusted her chair so she could reach everything. "This one's more thoughtful than most husbands out there," she said, smiling with her eyes. Nathaniel chuckled. Helen just rolled her eyes, but didn't hide the faint blush rising in her cheeks. After breakfast, Helen left for the pharmacy. Nathaniel stayed behind, washing dishes, organizing pantry jars, and sorting her mother's medication by time of day. Then he took out the trash and picked up some broken roof tiles from the old chicken coop out back. On his way back, he passed the garage where Helen kept the tools and grabbed the drill to fix one of the living room outlets. While he worked on the fuse box, the dog barked at the gate, lying down as if warning that someone was approaching. "Easy, they'll pass," Nathaniel said to the dog without turning. Day by day, his presence became part of the house. He no longer felt like a guest. Helen left him alone with her mother. He did the shopping, cooked, cleaned the garden. He even started jotting short grocery lists in crooked handwriting on a piece of paper taped to the fridge. Helen noticed the changes slowly. She began leaving for work a little later, started leaving small tasks unfinished, just so he could complete them. And when she returned, her eyes searched for his before anything else. On Tuesday afternoon, he tried to make a roast, but forgot the oven on too high. When Helen walked into the kitchen, smoke had already started to fill the ceiling, the smell of burnt meat thick in the air. "God, did you kill the cow twice?" she said, laughing. Nathaniel opened the oven, coughing. "I swear I followed the recipe, at least for the first 5 minutes." She turned everything off, opened the windows, waving a dish towel at the smoke. Once the kitchen was cleared, the 2 of them sat on the floor with bread and cheese and laughed. Laughed until their stomachs hurt. Helen's mother appeared in the doorway, confused. "What's going on in here?" "Emergency dinner," Nathaniel answered, still holding the cheese. Helen looked at him like she was seeing a lighter version of him for the first time. The next morning, as Helen organized documents for a home visit, Nathaniel passed through the living room carrying a bucket and broom. "Heading out?" "Mrs. Cedar called. Said the bathroom's leaking again. I'm gonna take a look." Helen paused. "You're a plumber now?" "Only until I fix the problem. And if you can't, then I'll learn, like with the oven." She smiled, said nothing else. Later that day, they stopped at the store. While Helen picked out vegetables, Nathaniel grabbed cookies and coffee. In the checkout line, a black car with tinted windows drove slowly past the street in front of the store. Nathaniel froze. The bag of rice slipped from his hand and hit the floor. Helen turned. "What was that?" He bent down, picked up the bag and tried to smile. "Nothing, just back pain." But Helen knew it was something else. His eyes had changed. For a moment, they returned to the emptiness she'd seen that first day. On the drive home, he was quiet, avoided looking out the window. When they parked, she left the groceries in the seat and turned to him, hand still on the key. "You need to tell me if you're running from someone." He took a deep breath, looked up at the sky. "I'm not running. I don't want to go back to a place where no one sees me for who I am now." She didn't push, just nodded and got out of the car. That night, Helen turned on her mother's old radio. The same music from other days began to play. Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway with 2 mugs of tea. "Peppermint for you, whatever for me." She took the mug, took a sip, and watched him lean against the doorframe. "You like this, don't you, the house, the pace? I like not having to pretend, not being called sir, not hearing, 'What are you going to do now with all your fortune?' Here, I'm just a guy who doesn't know how to use the oven." She smiled but didn't respond, just walked over to the couch and sat down. He followed. The dog jumped up and curled at their feet. They sat there side by side, no touch, no words, but everything said. When her mother went upstairs, Helen turned off the living room light. Shadows wrapped around them. Nathaniel leaned in, but paused halfway. She noticed. "You don't have to promise me anything," she said, still facing forward. "I'm not promising either." He just nodded, then slowly reached out and touched her hand. They stayed like that, holding hands beneath the muffled sound of the radio, while the night settled over the house with the quiet of someone who, for the first time, had found a place they might finally belong. Water splashed from the pot when Helen turned the handle with more force than she meant to. Nathaniel, sitting at the table, smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, and walked over with a towel in hand. "It's okay," he said, wiping the stove. "I like it when you cook angry." Helen huffed but laughed. The morning felt like any other. The kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and toasted bread. The soft instrumental music from the radio was familiar. Outside, the wind rustled the thin trees on the hillside, and the autumn sky cast a golden hue over everything. Nathaniel wore a flannel shirt she didn't remember seeing before. His hair, now shorter, was combed back, and there was a barely visible light in his eyes, like he was seeing everything with doubled attention. "Is it Tuesday today?" he asked. "It is. Why?" "It just feels like a Tuesday." Helen frowned but didn't push. She poured the coffee, placed 2 plates on the table, and sat across from him. They ate in silence, with the sounds of the house filling the space. Clinking utensils, the kettle's whistle, her mother's heavy steps upstairs. After breakfast, Nathaniel washed the dishes while Helen gathered the dry laundry from the porch. He folded each piece with near ceremonial care, as if folding something far too precious to wrinkle. "You're acting weird today," Helen said, tossing a shirt over the back of a chair. He looked up and gave a quiet smile. "I'm just grateful." She paused for a moment, watching him. But it wasn't just gratitude. There was weight in the way he looked at her, like someone saying goodbye with their eyes. The rest of the day, Nathaniel stayed close, but quiet. He helped Helen prepare lunch, picked herbs from the garden, gently touched her back when passing behind her. Small gestures that had become routine, but now each one felt like a farewell. Mid-afternoon, Helen found one of his shirts hanging on the door hook in the guest room. The blue one he wore the most, now ironed, no creases. "Why'd you leave this here?" she called from the living room. No response. She found him outside, sweeping dry leaves in the yard. He looked over his shoulder and smiled, but said nothing. Just returned to the slow movement of the broom. At dusk, they cooked dinner together like always. She chopped vegetables, he watched the rice. No accidents this time, no burnt food. Everything was perfectly timed, perfectly warm. They ate as if time had paused. After dinner, he washed while she dried. When they finished, he stood there, hands resting on the sink, staring at the light's reflection in the dark window. "Helen," he said without turning. She waited, but nothing followed. He simply turned off the faucet, dried his hands, and left the kitchen. Later, already in pajamas, Helen found him folding laundry in the living room. He was meticulous, focused, as if every fold had a purpose. Next to him, a blank sheet of paper, a pen resting gently beside it. She sat on the couch, pulled a blanket over her lap, and turned on the TV. Nathaniel came over and sat beside her, but didn't hold her. He just leaned his head back on the cushion and closed his eyes. The movie played all the way through without either of them saying a word. When Helen woke up, morning light streamed through the cracks in the curtains. The couch was empty, the blanket tossed over the arm of the chair. The kettle was whistling faintly. She stood slowly, a strange chill settling over her. The house felt too quiet for that time of day. She walked through the kitchen, then down the hall. "Nathaniel?" Nothing. The guest room was neat, the bed made, his clothes folded on the dresser, the blue shirt carefully hung. On the kitchen table, beside a cooling teapot, was an envelope. She froze. The silence around her felt heavier. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. She opened it slowly. The note inside was simple. No date, no signature. "You taught me how to live. Now I need to keep saving others, the way you saved me." Helen let the paper slide back onto the table. She stood there for long seconds, just staring at the empty envelope, the untouched tea, the chair where he always sat. The front door was locked from the inside, no trace of where he could have gone, only absence filling every space. She opened the window. The morning air rushed in, sharp and cold. In the distance, just birdsong, no cars, no footsteps, nothing. In that moment she knew he wasn't coming back. And still, somehow he hadn't really left. The door slammed shut as Helen returned from the market, 2 heavy bags in her arms. The light rain that had started on her way back was now falling harder, making the porch slippery and the air thick with cold. She dropped the bags on the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and leaned against the sink. The silence in the house had felt deeper ever since that morning she woke up alone. She glanced at the clock above the fridge. Almost 10. By now, he would have been making tea, usually with a dish towel slung over one shoulder and bare feet on the wooden floor. But now the kettle sat cold, the towel neatly folded. His mug, the one she couldn't bring herself to put away, hadn't moved in days. She sighed. Pouring herself a glass of water, she climbed the stairs and entered her mother's room, where she was asleep, with a battery-powered radio playing an old tune. Helen adjusted the blanket over her shoulders and went back downstairs. Something inside her refused to stop, as if by continuing the routines, she could hold on to the last traces of him still living in the house. She put on her raincoat, laced her boots, and stepped outside. In the shed out back, His toolbox was exactly where he'd left it. The wrenches lined up by size, the pliers each in its proper slot, as if he might return at any moment. There was a clipboard nearby with a list: fence, finish north side, ladder, reinforce third step, chicken coop door, replace hinge. Helen read the list for a few seconds. Then, without thinking much, she grabbed a pair of gloves, a hammer, and a box of nails. The fence on the north side ran to the edge of the property, lined with bushes twisting in the wind. Some posts leaned, others were missing. He'd started the work just last week. Helen remembered him there, kneeling, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his face sweaty and focused. He didn't speak. He just built. She drove in the first nail with 2 solid hits. The sound echoed through the empty yard. She moved along the fence, adjusting one post at a time, hammering in the same rhythm he used to. Silent, focused, the world beyond faded. Only the rain, the smell of wet wood, and the sharp clang of nails filled the air. It took nearly 3 hours. When she was done, she stepped back a few paces and looked at the finished fence. A continuous line, simple, sturdy, quiet, just the way he would have made it. Back inside, she returned the tools to their place and washed her hands at the outdoor sink with bar soap. The cold water stung her skin, but she didn't flinch. The act of washing felt like a ritual, rinsing off not just dirt, but the weight of the day, the emptiness, the absence. She stepped into the kitchen. On the table were the vegetables still waiting to be chopped, the bread still needing to be stored, and the mug she still wouldn't move. She gathered the breakfast dishes, washed them, dried them, and put everything away. Everything except his mug. She dried it carefully, turned it over in her hands, and placed it back on the table, facing hers. She turned on the radio. A soft piano melody filled the room. She sat down, looked around. Nothing was out of place, and yet everything was different. Upstairs, the door opened suddenly. "Is he back yet?" her mother asked, slowly making her way down with her cane. Helen watched her in silence for a moment, then, with a small smile on her lips, answered, "No, but he's already been here." Her mother nodded, as if she understood. She sat in the armchair by the window and gazed out at the rain. Helen stood up, walked to the window as well, pulled the curtains open and looked out at the world, the wet road, the swaying trees, the birds perched on the branches. The house was quiet, but somehow he was still there. In the reinforced fence, the neatly arranged tools, the mug still sitting on the table. In the tea she now made without thinking. In the radio that seemed to turn itself on. In the way she stared into nothing and found a presence in the empty spaces.
What it meant to you.
She closed
Remember
the
to hit the like and subscribe buttons. This is really important for the channel.
She ended
Really
everything that
important.
needed to be said.
And if you're ready for another story of love and hope, click the first card or the second one to watch the full playlist. See you there.